Our second paper is Not Home Yet, C.S. Lewis's Vision of Hell as the End of Some Stories, presented by Rev Dr Reggie Weems. Reggie Weems has served as the senior pastor at Heritage Baptist Church since 1991. Married to his childhood sweetheart, he and his wife have 3 children and 10 grandchildren. He earned his Doctor of Ministry from Liberty University and his PhD from the University of Babeș-Bolyai. Is that how it's pronounced? In Cluj, Romania.
Better known for his visions of heaven, C.S. Lewis unapologetically believed in the reality of hell. According to Peter Kreeft, Lewis approached the unpopular doctrines of heaven and hell and the existence of the devil with a kind of seriousness that labeled him a conservative. It also invoked ridicule among Oxford elites and myriad other questions about the supernatural and eschatology. Of course, the picture of his face on Time magazine between an angel's wing and the caricature of Satan may have increased his popularity amongst the general public, but it didn't win him any fans in the academic world. In that regard, it might be more appropriate to say that he unapologetically, brazenly affirmed the reality of hell. As he once rhetorically asked, "Do you really mean to reintroduce our old friend the devil, horns and hoofs and all?" And answered, "Yes, I do. I do not claim to know anything about his personal appearance. If anybody really wants to know him better, I would say to that person, don't worry. If you really want to, you will. Whether you like it when you do is another thing." Such unambiguous claims led Glenn Watkins to view Lewis as a traditionalist who believes in an everlasting hell. But other scholars consider Lewis's musings about hell to be confusing at best and incoherent at worst. Clark Pinnock is altogether unsure whether Lewis was consistent in his views of the nature of hell. Austin Farrer deems Lewis traditionally orthodox, with an argument that commends our grave respect. Yet he concludes, Lewis's further speculations on the state of the damned appear inconsistent, if not altogether unintelligible. And yet, hell, as the potential terminus in which Lewis viewed it, moved him to write about the subject with practical vigor and sincere warnings. Books like The Pilgrim's Regress, in which Lewis illustrates hell from God's viewpoint, the Screwtape Letters, where we see hell from its own vantage point, and The Great Divorce, viewed from a human perspective, immediately come to mind. Each of these books, as others in Lewis' corpus, transport readers far up into the inexpressible heights of heaven and deep down into the indescribable depths of hell. It's been said that Lewis wrote very little about hell, and this may be true when compared to the overall production of his pen, but perhaps he was trying to hold the doctrine in an appropriate tension. In the Screwtape Letters, Lewis wrote, "There are 2 equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other, to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist or a magician in the same light." Yet even nonfiction works like Mere Christianity, The Allegory of Love, Reflection on the Psalms, and Miracles contribute to Lewis's vision of the miserific world. Hell. It even found its way into English literature in the 16th century. It appears from his first book, that fiction apologetic, The Pilgrim's Regress, to his final book. Hell either forms the backdrop of Lewis's writing scheme, or, like Lewis said of Aslan in the Chronicles, it comes bounding into other works. My contention is that hell was a very personal subject for Lewis, and one that he often addressed for what he perceived to be very practical reasons, and further, that he was clear and consistent in his descriptions of this most difficult subject. First, with regard to the practicality with which he addressed the subject, Lewis once acknowledged, "But if in my books I have spoken too much about hell, and if critics want a historical explanation of the fact, they must not seek it in the supposed Puritanism of my Ulster childhood, but in the Anglo-Catholicism of the church at Belsen. I feared for my soul." He transparently, no pun intended, illustrated that concern at the end of The Great Divorce when he found himself a ghost as the rumored and feared twilight finally fell into night's darkness. This may be why Austin Farrer concluded that Lewis's musings were nothing more than tortured speculations when he considered hell. In other words, Lewis wrote about hell because he feared for his own soul and thought everyone else should also. Few things could be more practical, especially in light of what Lewis thought was to be gained or was to be lost. After all, there are not many people who tell the story of heaven or the story of hell like Lewis. His ability to describe what he saw, both directly in nonfiction and indirectly through fiction, have won him a legion of growing readers. Yet there's something about the way he says things that makes us want to live as a Narnian, even if we don't believe in Narnia. In various genres, Lewis attempted to verbally paint this fully unknowable reality in word colors that faithfully portrayed his vision of it. In this scheme, or in his scheme, heaven is likened to an unending story that only gets better with time. Hell, on the other hand, is a final, fixed, sad, and horrific end of some stories. Another reason hell played a significant role in Lewis's thinking is because he held an extremely high view of humanity. He thought God created humans in the Imago Dei, copies of Maleldil, intended to realize the fullness of that design ultimately in heaven, a heaven so wonderful, Lewis said it was almost indecent to mention it. In his worldview, Jesus is God's incarnate human, the one man who really was all that men are intended to be. As he wrote in Mere Christianity, the Son of God became a man to enable men to become the sons of God. Hence, all other humans are created to be formed into that image. Every Christian, he wrote, is to become a little Christ. The whole purpose of becoming a Christian is simply nothing else. This is true, even though we're obstinate toy soldiers meant to be humans, each of us a decent little cottage God is rebuilding into a palace. And the closer we get to God, the more that image is gloriously realized. It's hard to read the weight of glory and not feel the weight of that potential reality. Creatures made in the image of Lord Adam and Lady Eve, humans possess both potential for honor and shame. This prospect for the latter is real in Lewis because, as William Luther Wright notes, Lewis thought the human race is fallen and continually falling. And it's this falling away from God that may have most troubled Lewis. That realized image is incredible beyond description, but so is its loss. Such loss, such a fall, is catastrophic because there are no ordinary mortals. Every human is immortal, destined and daily moving toward the ultimate either-or of heaven and hell. More, people bound for heaven are becoming creatures who, if presently seen in their glorified form, might be worshipped. As Tor Araso remarked, our bodies will be changed, but not all changed. We shall be as Eldila, but not all as Eldila. Contrarily, those people bound for hell are becoming beings of multiplying nightmarish proportion. Hence, Lewis wrote, to enter heaven is to become more human than you've ever succeeded in being on earth. To enter hell is to be banished from humanity. This is one of the reasons why hell cannot be in any way corresponding to heaven. Hell is not the opposite of heaven, as the inhabitants of hell are not respectively different from those in heaven. A human deprived of God's presence is not simply less than a human being, but lacking humanity altogether. This is what Lewis meant when he said that the damned go to a place never made for men at all. In his thinking, no human is in hell. For heaven, he wrote, is the home of humanity and therefore contains all that's implied of a glorified human life. But hell was not made for men. As such, according to Lewis, hell is in no sense parallel to heaven. It's the darkness outside, the outer rim where being fades. Cut off from God, what was human is no longer. And this, according to Lewis, is what makes hell unspeakably horrible. Who among mortals can imagine such an existence? Well, Lewis did his best to describe it. And yet, in the midst of such unimaginable horror, Lewis, as perhaps only he could, found a goodness of God in hell. In The Pilgrim's Regress, Lewis defined it as a black hole, the worst thing which keeps evil from reaching its uncontrollable vilest. It's a tourniquet that keeps the lost soul from bleeding into an unreachable death. As such, It's the landlord's last service to those who have refused every other mercy. As John's guide sings, God in his mercy made the fixed pains of hell. Thus, Lewis's primary focus was rarely on the properties of hell itself, but the nature of those who inhabit it. In other words, he was concerned for all of us. For instance, he chronicled his version of cosmic eschatology in the Chronicles of Narnia, but did so in the context of many personal eschatologies. For instance, in The Magician's Nephew, the cabbie Frank cries, "Glory be, I'd have been a better man all my life if I'd known things were like this." In The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, 4 everyday normal English children are radically transformed into kings and queens of Narnia. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace is de-dragoned and, though not immediately cured, nonetheless becomes a different boy. In The Horse and His Boy, Shasta escapes slavery to discover his royal lineage and become the king of Archenland. Outside the Chronicles of Narnia, Sarah Smith's acclamation in The Great Divorce is all the more illustrious in contrast with Frank's dwarfism. Even the dying lizard became a winged stallion, and his rider, once a ghost, became a new-made man. And until we have faces, even Oral gains Psyche's face before her dream ends. When thinking of personal eschatologies, The Great Divorce may be Lewis's magnum opus, and yet, as Malcolm reminded us earlier, Lewis imagined that book in the form of a dream. He did not intend readers to propound abstract doctrines about heaven and hell. The transmortal conditions of which Lewis wrote, he said, were wholly speculative, placed in a supposal, and not even a guess or a speculation at what may actually await us. He confessed, "The last thing I want to do is arouse factual curiosity about the details of the afterworld." But it isn't as though Lewis hadn't already done this. In fact, he was very clear about the nature of hell only 5 years earlier in The Problem of Pain. And in it, he offers 4 important revelations about the end of some of our stories. First, Lewis indicated that he was not an annihilationist. One might naturally assume, Lewis wrote, that destruction means the unmaking or cessation of the destroyed. And then he countered, "And people often talk as if the annihilation of a soul were intrinsically possible." But he argued, the destruction of one thing means the emergence of something else. For instance, he wrote, "If you burn a log, you have at least ash, gas, or heat. To have been a log means now being at least one of those 3 things." In other words, once something exists, it always does, albeit in a different form. What remains maybe only truly remains, as Lewis called it, but whatever it is, it remains nonetheless. In the case of the log, it's not what it was, but it is something. Perhaps this is what Lewis intended to illustrate theologically when the sentient beasts lost their ability to speak, but nonetheless remain beasts. Or perhaps that's what he meant in the immortal souls outside of time who watch themselves make long ago choices on the chessboard of life. This means to exist in hell, in Lewis's words, is to have been a man. In the 1940s, The Problem of Pain. To be an unman in the 1943 Paralandra, or a damned ghost in the 1945 The Great Divorce. Secondly, Lewis also intimated belief in conscious torment, although he acknowledged it's impossible to imagine what the consciousness of such a creature might be. He surmised, "To be a complete man means to have the passions obedient to the will and the will offered to God. To have been a man, to be an ex-man or a damned ghost, would presumably mean to consist of a will utterly centered in itself and passions utterly uncontrolled by the will." That may have been a preview of Lewis's thinking 5 years later in The Great Divorce, when he wrote about a woman who no longer grumbled, but was simply and wholly a grumble. And even though Lewis recognizes the actual unknowability of such a consciousness, such an existence, he does contend for it in The Pilgrim's Regress, The Problem of Pain, and most of all, The Great Divorce. After all, according to Lewis, God cannot condone evil by ignoring it. The person who goes to hell cannot be confirmed in his happiness, perfectly convinced the laugh is on his side. For, Lewis wrote, even mercy can hardly wish to such a man his eternal contented continuance in such a ghastly illusion. Oh no, the pain of hell is the flag of truth planted within a rebel fortress. Thirdly, Lewis was not as concerned with the duration or eternality of hell as he was with its finality, writing, I notice that our Lord, while stressing the terror of hell with unsparing severity, usually emphasizes the idea not of duration, but of finality. In his thinking, God would give a schoolboy 1,000,000 chances to take an exam if he thought it might do him good. He wrote, but a master often knows when boys and parents do not, that it's really useless to send a boy in for a certain examination again. Finality must come at some time. And omniscience knows better than anyone when this is. Thus, God, as the wisest teacher, knows when it's futile to keep testing a student. He will never pass. In other words, there comes a time when we're no longer simply bent with the hope of reclamation, but we are broken beyond repair. This is because, according to Lewis, the divine labor to redeem the world cannot be certain of succeeding as regards every individual soul. Some will not be redeemed. Even though hell is a terrible doctrine, and Lewis wished that it didn't exist, he knew if a game is played, it must be possible to lose. After all, how can people be saved if they will not give in? And some people would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. As such, Lewis did not believe every human being goes to heaven, even though it appears he constantly held out hope otherwise. This means, fourthly, Lewis was not a universalist. 19 years after the problem of pain, and only 4 years before his death, Lewis denied universalism in a letter to Alan Fairhurst. He wrote this, I parted company from MacDonald on that point because of a higher authority. The dominical utterances themselves seem to me irreconcilable with universalism. The finality of the either or, the sheep, the goats, the wheat and tares, the wise and foolish virgins is so emphatic and reiterated in our Lord's teaching that, in my opinion, it simply cannot be ignored. If we do not know that he said that, then we do not know what he said about anything. And this is my sole reason. And then he added, need I add that I should very much prefer to follow GM in this point, if I could? In spite of thinking about Lewis's vagueness, inconsistencies, or unintelligibility concerning hell, it does appear that he was clear and coherent in his thinking and in his portrayals. Did he die without closing every open door? Of course. No finite mind can fully ever comprehend or depict something as terrible as hell. But the bottom line is that it's often not what he said or didn't say, but the genre in which he said it, or the audience to whom he said it, that sometimes confuses readers. Then again, as C.D.F. Moll wrote, it may be that some C.S. Lewis scholars don't want to reach conviction about Lewis's thoughts on hell. But there really is very little question about this particular issue. Heaven is an unending story that only gets better with time. Hell is the definite and irreversible destruction of the Imago Dei. And this is how the writer of Narnia saw the end of some of our stories. Thank you.